I'm feeling inspired to share a story here. It just feels like as we're entering into this solar field, as you can see, if you've connected here on this page, we're moving into this solar energetic, solar frequency within the Rainbow Serpent journey that I offer. And along the way, different places I've traveled to around the world uh, are really part of the journey and part of the story of unlocking specific insight and wisdoms that are held within the body of the earth. So on my journeys, I have traveled to a lot of sacred sites, and I've noticed in all these places, there is dual currents. So often places where both solar fields as well as deep, ancient, primordial earth fields will cross over. So it's like this masculine and feminine crossing. And many temples around the world will demonstrate this by having a solar temple that is built atop a place that used to be an ancient temple to the earth goddess. So one such site that I want to share my story of is Delphi. So in the myth of Delphi, the story goes that Zeus released two eagles and set them off flying in opposite directions. And the place where they actually came back together and crossed, that center point was where he proclaimed the navel of the earth was, and this is called the Omphalos. So this has been an ancient pilgrimage site for a very, very long time. That was not only a temple of Apollo was built. So Apollo was known to be a god of light, of truth, of consciousness, and a messenger god, but also he was the slayer of the great python. And interestingly, that before it was a area that was known to be an Apollo temple, it was actually an ancient center of Gaia, where the great serpent Python was the guardian energy there. So even when, in ancient Greek times, all these temple structures were built and the Temple of Apollo was there for people to make pilgrimage to, there were still priestesses that would connect in with the earth energies and the great python, and they were known as the Pythia, and they were the ones that would translate the messages from the earth to bring to light or to bring insight to all those that seeked guidance. And they would be people who would come to receive information about war and strategy, and people were coming from all over the ancient world to get this insight. And of course, famously inscribed on the temple walls within Delphi is the saying, "Know thyself." And that really is the essence of the solar field and why we make pilgrimage in the first place. All of these places, even though they may be offering prophecy, they may be offering guidance and insight, ultimately it's the shining the light, the solar field, the sun temples that are shining the light into the depths of self, into our own wisdom that is within. So I hope you enjoy this story about my journey to Delphi and the deeper unfoldings that happen on the way. So I felt the call to pilgrimage myself to Delphi for quite some time. I grew up on all the classics, all the heroic stories of Homer and the Iliad, of Jason and the Golden Fleece, of all of these ancient tales that were told to me by my grandparents, by my dad used to tell me these stories. We'd even, watch them in videos, Medusa, all of these stories were fascinating to me. The deep myth and the undercurrent that was woven through them, it really speaks to our psyche. And I knew there would be a time that I would make my own pilgrimage to this place. And although there were many opportunities for me to go at different stages I knew it didn't feel quite right yet because I felt there was an enormity to it. And often it's the way when we visit sacred sites or we do some kind of pilgrimage, really we have to be ready within, because it's really the journey of the self, and everything in our outer world is giving us insight into our inner world to take us deeper. So a lot of my journeys have been to places that are solar temples, but also deep within caves of the earth. And my story of Delphi comes in a couple of parts because I was in the area for a while. And, these days when we visit these ancient sites, now it's very, full of tourism, and it's harder to tap in to, if you're a sensitive and an energetic person like myself, you still have to navigate the fact that there's hordes of tourists and all of those things. So there is definitely an inner preparation that is required, but also navigating the reality of the 21st century at these places. So I started my journey in a little town called Chrysos, which actually means gold, and it has the name Chrysos. It's like Christ. And of course, the Christed energy is this golden field as well. And the energy of gold is that alchemical luminescence. And this is one of the crystalline frequencies that opens the field that we're going to be journeying with throughout the solar rainbow serpent pathway. So while I was in Chrysos, I decided to take a little walk down to a church that on the way to Kira, the village of Kira, down towards the Mediterranean. And it's a beautiful walk through the olive groves and through all the beautiful spring flowers at the time. And this was a little church to St. George. And it's interesting the correlations I noticed along the path in various countries, the correlations between Apollo temples, sun temples, Archangel Michael or Saint Michael, and also Saint George. So all of these, even though through slightly different cultural lens or religious lenses, ultimately these are all very similar frequencies, and they often, I think Saint George is the physical embodiment of Archangel Michael. And I've walked along the Michael lines at various times on pilgrimage, and these are quite interchangeable energies: Apollo temples, Michael cathedrals, or St. George. So what Apollo, Archangel Michael, and St. George all have in common is they're all depicted either wrestling with or slaying a great serpent or dragons. And, through a religious lens, this could be seen as good triumphing over evil, or the light conquering the dark. But as we know from temples all over the world, all these solar temples, whether they be in South America, throughout Europe, through Mesopotamia, through Egypt, there are always temples built upon ancient temples, built upon more temples. Like, there are so many layers. And when you start peeling down deeper, you realize all of these locations where ancient solar temples reside, there was once this was a power place where people came to worship the goddess, to worship the primordial energy within the earth, that were real visceral currents that moved through these areas. These were the areas that we now call ley lines. Often there are underground water channels and lava tubes, and there's so much moving energy within the electromagnetic pulse of the earth. So these places call us in. They call us in, whether we're attracted to the sun temples or whether we're attracted to something that's deeper, that lays underneath. But ultimately, I like to see this as the Apollo temples or the sun temples were about shining the light of consciousness, the higher vision, bringing the light that is ultimately what we're trying to embody within our physical vessels, but shining it into the depths, into the dark recesses of self. You know, we all have our own demons to slay. We all have our own things that we wrestle with in the dark. And it's like entering a dark cave. It's what we don't know that causes the fear to arise. But it's when we are able to bring our light of consciousness, to really know ourselves, that we can bring light into these dark and deep places within ourselves, where we're no longer thinking what monsters are laying deep within the back of the cave, and perhaps what lays within the depths is actually wisdom that is meant to be integrated within us. So that's how I like to see it. And every sacred site that I go to visit, often up mountains, often these beautiful solar temples, close by there will either be a lake, a body of water, a well, a spring, or a cave. And often it's in these places that hold the mystery of the feminine currents to balance out that more solar consciousness, which has more of that masculine energetic to it. And really, I love to see it like these are the places where these lines cross, where these energies come together, are really places of unity, of a unified field that really can't exist if the opposite was not in place. So having these two currents really brings us into the center of self and brings us into the deep knowing of self. Before entering these sacred sites, it's really a beautiful practice to find a body of water or a way in which you can purify and cleanse yourself before entering. This is a practice that all pilgrims would have done and would know, whether that's modern day pilgrims like myself or people from the ancient past. This would have been a practice that was part of the preparation to enter the field. And there was a spring at the entrance of Delphi, the site of Delphi, called the Castilian Spring, which pilgrims would have purified. There are like bathing vats that you would go in to prepare energetically. And these days, unfortunately, you can't go into this space. There's a little spout of water that goes into the gutter that, you know, if you know to do that, you could splash yourself. But really, it is tricky these days now. The ways in which the pilgrims would have cleansed to enter the field is not always available. So, of course, you know, I saw the opportunity to do this when I came across a spring on my walk from the little church I told you about of St. George. I walked all the way up the valley to Delphi, and about halfway along I came across this amazing, beautiful plane tree with a huge trunk, super wide, and I thought it was a really great place to just take a little break and have a rest. And, you know, the walk was probably maybe an hour, maybe an hour and a half, maybe two. But, you know, it was sunny. It's the middle of May when I was walking, and it was just really lovely to have a little pit stop before I ascended further to the town of Delphi. And I started to hear this trickling sound when I was sitting under the tree, and I discovered there was a spring coming forward from the rock face just behind where the tree was. So even though at the time I didn't know that the Castilian spring had been closed off, I really felt that this was the time for me to purify, to anchor in, to ground, and to prepare myself to enter the site. So I wanted to mention that just in case any of you are feeling called to pilgrimage there. And if you do find yourself walking, there is this spring that feeds the Castilian spring, also trickles down the valley, so you can access it at various other sites. So I went into Once I reached Delphi, I went into the museum there, which was beautiful, and then into the site itself. And of course, it was really beautiful to see the layout, to be in the space. It's really quite majestic. Yet at the same time, as I mentioned, there's lots of people coming and going. And there's also, it's just finding the place where you feel comfortable to really drop in without interruption. It can be a little harder to navigate. So I was really just taking a moment to tune in enough just to ask the question, where can I make offerings? Because I feel that when I go to these sites, it just feels so natural to purify, come with intention, make offerings before asking for something. It's sort of like getting us into this field of reciprocity with the earth. And all earth-based cultures love this practice of making offerings, and it doesn't always feel really aligned to do that when you're in a tourist site, right? And so I just tuned in enough just to say, I would like to make offerings, and where can I do this? And just, thinking I would find somewhere within this temple site to do that. And I sat for a while in meditation, and the message that came through was an acknowledgement of my intention. And I really felt it was like a thank you for returning. This place definitely felt deeply familiar on layers that are probably archetypal and mythic and who knows what else, but it definitely felt like a returning. And the message that I got loud and clear was, we will show you where to make your offerings within 3 days. So I was like, oh, okay, looks like I'm not doing it here today at the Temple of Delphi. So I was okay with that. And I just wanted to share that experience because I think when we enter sites, it's really important just to take a moment just to inquire, because sometimes it's not always what we think. It's not always going to be right in the central altar place that we're doing our magical things. It's really great to be in places and to listen and feel for the guidance that wants to come through. So within 3 days, I did receive the clues of where to find a place to make my offerings. And I had looked at a map, and I could see that above Delphi, up in the Parnassus mountains, there was indeed a cave called the Corinthian cave. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But this was a cave that was originally dedicated to Pan, god of the forest and of the frivolity and of sensuality and play. It sort of has a bit of a Dionysian energy, Pan. And this was also, I discovered, a place where the Pythia would go, the priests and priestesses of Apollo would go to this site before going to the temple, down the Apollo temple in Delphi. So it was almost like they would do their own ceremony within this ancient temple of Pan connected to the earth, and from that place they would go through their purification processes, and then enter the temple of Apollo to be able to give prophecy to all those governors and generals and different people who came for advice at this site. So I discovered that this cave was about a day's walk from Delphi. So I decided to move where I was staying up to Delphi so I could walk from there. And, when I set off on this adventure, the weather wasn't so good, but I was kind of happy by that because, when you're walking in the sun all day, it can be quite exhausting. So I didn't mind that it was overcast, and I didn't even mind if it rained a little bit, because I thought, oh, good, less tourists, this would be great. So I started off on my walk, and like we start any pilgrimage, I can recognize this energy that of the beginning phase of any journey is we start off with our hearts full of hope in this light-hearted kind of way. Again, I'm going to make reference to the Fool card in the tarot. Have you seen that? Like that young person with their knapsack on their back, and they're just like they're wandering off into the distance without any kind of understanding of what dangers and perils lie ahead. But I definitely started like this. I had a little backpack, I had some snacks, I had my phone, I had, all the things that I thought I needed, some water. And I was just so enchanted and just in my happy place to be walking in the mountains up above Delphi. I was coming across all these ruins, like it was outside of the temple site, but I came across these ruins and I'm like, wow, there's like no one here. And I'm able to really be amongst it and feel it and see it, and getting an amazing view of the site from above. And I was just so thrilled with all the wildlife. I was literally taking my time, stopping to smell the roses, so to speak. It was springtime, so it was, mid-May at this time. So there were so many wildflowers just abloom. There were giant bumblebees. I was just in my element. Just really felt like, yes, this is great. Anyway, after a few hours of walking, the weather started to close in a bit, and for those of you that have seen my other story of walking and doing Vision Quest and Thunder Mountain, it was a very similar energy, because I all of a sudden could hear these massive claps of thunder and big thuds of rain starting to come. And I really got the sense that Zeus was in the mountains throwing around his lightning bolts. It felt very ominous. And I picked up the pace. I'm like, okay, enough smelling the flowers. Let's just get going. Let's get to this cave before it starts to downpour. So I kept going, and eventually I reached the mouth of this cave. And luckily, before there was some rain, and it was cold. It was really windy. I didn't have that much on. I had some shorts on and a little singlet, but luckily I had a rain jacket. I had my scarf wrapped around me, trying to keep warm. So yeah, I really had picked up the pace to warm up a little. And by the time I got to the mouth of this cave, it was quite ominous. The actual cave itself had a big boulder at the entrance, and the big boulder looked like a tongue that was sticking outside of this giant gaping mouth that had all these stalactites that go down? Stalagmites, the ones that drip down and look like jagged teeth. It looked like I was going into the mouth of a great beast. And even though there was a bit of, trepidation, and also just the awareness of entering this sacred space, I didn't know what lay beyond the threshold. Yet outside it was cold and windy and raining, and Zeus was throwing around his lightning bolts. So I quickly splashed myself to freshen up a little and tried to compose myself as I entered the cave. I was quite astounded at the cavity, the enormity of the inner landscape of the cave. It was huge. And to my surprise, there was a giant ring of stones, like a ceremonial ground, in the center of this cave. And it was obvious that this was a place where people do come and make offerings, because there were already, offerings that obviously were relatively fresh. There was fruit, there was flowers, there was incense sticks, there was pine cones. All these sort of earth offerings were put on the central altar. I was so transfixed with this space that, I obviously went in reverence. I made some offerings. I had bought some offerings from Australia. I'd been gifted various flowers and resins and things that held value to me at the time. So I made prayers with each of these offerings, and I also offered some of the holy waters I'd collected from various places on my journeys from other sacred sites around the world, as well as from back home in Australia. And while I was there, I also collected the water that was dropping from the stalagmites, because I was making beautiful elixirs out of all these holy waters. So I really was in an activated space while I was in the cave. And although I wanted to, my intention was to just sit down and meditate and drop in, I was just really activated. And I was taking photos, I was making little movies. And maybe this is something you don't normally do in a sacred site, but I was just like, wow, wow, this is so cool. I couldn't quite believe it. I think it might have been the electrical energy in the air from the storm. Um, but right down the back of the cave, I could see there was this big dark hole. And towards the back of the cave, it kind of looked a bit more darker and jagged, all these stalactites and stalagmites. And it just looked a little bit more scary down the back there, especially with this big ominous hole. And it was kind of the size of a hole that I imagined a great python coming out of. And so even though I sat down and meditated for a while, it felt really eerie to be sitting in this cave that was dripping and moist and damp in the middle of a storm, knowing that something could be coming out of the back of the cave behind me. So I was a little bit, I wasn't fearful, but I was certainly, there was that threshold, that edge where I was like, I don't know if I want to hang out here for too long. It feels quite, intense. So after a while, I felt like, look, I've done my offerings. I've dropped in for a bit, but I also knew I had a huge walk back home. So I continued onwards. And since the weather was it was getting late at this point. I think it was, I don't know, maybe 5 in the afternoon. And I decided I should try and take the road back, because there's actually a road. I'd walked up a walking track, but there's actually a road. And I thought, I'm going to take the road. It might be more direct. So off I go again, leaving the cave behind. And I start walking and walking and walking and walking. So I was looking on my maps on my phone, and, I originally, when I was at the cave, I could see that this road was going to eventually take me back to the town of Delphi. But when you're sort of second guessing yourself, and I kept on looking on my maps, and because I had been using my phone a fair bit for, I think when you've got the GPS on, or not the GPS, but if you're looking at the maps, it drains your battery really fast. So before long, my battery completely ran out, and I was like, great. I'm like going deeper into the mountains. It's about 5:36 at night, and the storm is still blowing around me, and I've got to somehow get back. So I decided to turn around and go back the way I came. Just cut my losses, just wasted an hour. I was really tired by this point too. I think, the journey up, I was just in the energy of excitement, so I wasn't really aware of how tired I was. And I went all the way back until I got to the mouth of the cave again. And by the time I got to the mouth of the cave, I was really tired, and I just needed a break. And as I leant against the big rock, the tongue-like rock at the entrance of the cave, catching my breath, I could just feel this magnetic pull pulling me back into the cave. And I thought, that's interesting. I feel like, I needed to go and exhaust myself, completely deplete my phone battery so I wasn't distracted anymore, to get me to the place where I could actually properly let it all go and be still and listen. So, there are no accidents, I think, when we are on pilgrimages and when we get lost. This getting lost in the wilderness is part of the journey, and it's almost a necessary part to get to the place where you feel so exhausted that you are defeated. And in that defeat, it's like your defenses are down. And it's only in that place that sometimes I think we're quiet enough still enough to be able to really receive what wants to come through for us. So I went back into the cave and I sat and I went deep. I went into a meditation, I don't know for how long, but I had a full visceral visual experience and I could hear the voice of the great python. And she said to me, "You are safe. You can let go now. Let go and drop in. Drop in deeper and deeper." So I allowed this voice to lull me into the depths of self, where everything, time, my journey home, everything before that point and what was to come ahead just dropped away. And I was able to really deeply go in. And I started to see a vision. And in this vision, I saw the great serpent come out from the hole in the back of the cave. And she came out slowly and went all the way around the great stone circle that I was sitting around. And she coiled all the way around until her head came and rested right in front of me. And in her mouth was a white egg. And she placed this egg in front of me. And it felt so real. The vision was like a waking dream. And I was just so tempted to open my eyes because I genuinely was like, I for real feel like this serpent has wrapped its way around me and has offered me this egg. And of course, when I opened my eyes, she wasn't there physically, but there was a white stone at the exact size and shape of the egg I had seen in the vision, right in front of me, which I hadn't seen before. I mean, maybe it was there, but I just hadn't noticed it. But to look down and to see this white egg-shaped stone was quite an experience. And I really received this as a gift and as an omen of new beginnings. You know, as we know, the natural cycles of the great serpent and of the seasons and of the earth are all about the pathways of growth and of decay and of death and of birth and of life and of rebirth. You know, these cycles and circles we're constantly journeying through. But I really took it as this sign of rebirth. And of course, the symbol of the egg, which has been carried forward into our traditions of Easter, is really significant as well. You know, it can be deciphered, this message, in so many different ways, and for me personally, but I just wanted to just share that insight or that vision that I received. And it was interesting because even on the way home, I did eventually find my way home. I was a little lost for a while, but I found the track and got back. And I had a bath that evening because I was exhausted. I'd been walking for hours. And I found the best moussaka I'd ever tasted in Greece as well. So I had a really great feed, and then I had a bath and I went under the water. And while I was under the water, I could hear her voice again. And she kept on saying to me, "Go deeper. You're safe. You can let go. Go deeper." So that is the invitation I wanted to offer you on your own solar pilgrimage to yourself, to know thyself. We have to go deep sometimes. We have to face those things that are perhaps frightening or rocking us to our core. But ultimately, that which we fear holds the gifts of what we can bring forth in our life. So I will see you on the next pilgrimage story. And until then, goodbye.